I think another thing that really stood out, and this actually is what led me into my dissertation research for my topic in my PhD was, and I get into this a bit in my book, Multitude of All Peoples. But, I think one thing that stood out to me that was also kind of encouraging, even though, in a way it's kind of discouraging, because there was a major church schism in the 5th century that I talk about in the book in the year 451, the Council of Chalcedon. And that was kind of the dividing point between the overwhelming majority of most of these ancient African Christian communities, and actually many of the communities in the Middle East and in Asia. This was actually kind of the big breaking point between the Church of the West and the Church of Africa and Asia. And that's a major reason why so many of us in the West today have never heard of these communities, because since the year 451 they've been split, and then Protestantism kind of came out of the church that split after the year 451 over 1,000 years later, and so there's just been kind of this rift that and we've never really connected with it. So I mean, that's a bad thing, and that's lamentable. But one of the interesting things and actually kind of encouraging things about that, even in the midst of that sad thing, was for me to learn and realize that not only have there been Christian churches in Africa since the very beginning of the church, but not only that, but also that they had a unique theology that was distinct from the European theology, and that in fact not only was it distinct, but it was actually at odds with the European theology. In fact, there's a long and ugly history of Western Christian persecution of African Christians, in the 400s and 500s and 600s. And so despite the fact that that's a bad thing, it's actually kind of encouraging, because again, so many people think that Christianity is a Western white religion and it only started for Black people in slavery. And there's even a lot of people in the Black community around the world, whether it's in the Americas or in Europe or on the continent. There's many people of African descent that sometimes think that, Christianity came from the white man and it was imposed upon us, and we've just kind of imbibed and regurgitated a Eurocentric Christianity. And so it's really encouraging actually to find out that not only were there African Christians from day one, but they also maintained their own distinct doctrine and their own distinct African theology that was not only different from the European theology, but it was actually even like that there was a strong sense of tension. So that just speaks to the ingenuity and the independence of ancient African Christianity.
Oh, that's fantastic. Are there any correlations in doctrines or areas where there were differences that were kind of emerging between the churches in Europe and the churches in Africa?
Yeah. Definitely. Well, and again, I think that that council that I just mentioned, and then kind of a lot of the tension and the schism that grew out of that, is probably the best example to just talk about some of the correlations, but also some of the differences between the Christianity that became dominant in what would later become known as Europe, and then the Christianity that became dominant in what would later become known as Africa. And again, the Council of Chalcedon was a Roman Church council that was trying to figure out how to talk about the humanity and divinity of Jesus. Now again, you mentioned correlations, and see, this is another point of importance, because another reason why so many of these ancient African and Asian Christian churches have been denied throughout history and underlooked or overlooked and understudied is because they've often been erroneously or unnecessarily been deemed as heretics. And you can honestly see this Eurocentric narrative being regurgitated even in many evangelical Western modern church history textbooks. Like in the omission of many of these church histories, they're often not mentioned, or if they are mentioned, they're briefly kind of just brushed aside as heretical. And the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which was superintended by the Roman Empire and the Pope of the Roman Church, is often presented as like the perfect middle ground, as it was like the best way of articulating the humanity and divinity of Jesus. Now, to be clear, all of the Christians in Europe and Asia and Africa, the majority of Christians in these parts of the world, and the popes and the main leaders of these different places, they all believed that Jesus was fully God and fully human, and that he was the only way, truth, and the life. And they believed in the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the Trinity. Everybody is a Christian. Everybody agreed on the fundamentals of the faith, and everyone believed that he was fully God and fully human. But they had different ideas about how to talk about that and how to word it or how to phrase it. And the Council of Chalcedon basically put out the language of saying that Jesus is one person, but he has two natures. So his humanity and divinity are unique natures, but they both exist in the one person. So a lot of that has to do with kind of like your understanding of Greek and Greek concepts and the difference between person and nature in that language. But some of these other people in other places and in other languages didn't have the same nuance between person and nature. And so in Africa, for example, many of the churches in Egypt and Nubia and Ethiopia, they did not like that definition because to them it sounded like what was being said was that there are two Jesuses. Now, to be fair, that's not what the Roman church was saying, but that's how it felt. And so they said, oh, he's one nature. Now, conversely, the Roman church misunderstood their theology and still does to this day, and basically caricaturized their theology as saying, well, you don't really believe, if you say one nature, that means you don't really believe Jesus is fully human. You think he's only God. Now, that's not at all what they were saying. That's not at all what the Egyptian or the Ethiopian church has ever believed. They have always believed in the full humanity and full divinity of Jesus. They just have a problem with the language of two natures. And so they say one nature. But they believe that that one nature is both fully God and fully human, just like the Western church believes that the one person of Jesus is fully God and fully human. So it was really a lot of semantic, linguistic, cultural, political differences that led to this major schism. But since the Roman church had more power, they came in and started to impose their theology. And you actually had Roman popes and bishops and monks backed by Roman soldiers and the Roman emperor coming into Egypt and coming into Syria and Arabia and imposing their doctrine and saying, you have to say two natures. If you don't believe in two natures, you're not a Christian and we're going to kill you. And they literally did often either kill church leaders in the Middle East or in Africa, or they would sometimes kidnap them and put in place a Roman leader that had their doctrine. So this was centuries of Christian on Christian violence that took place up until the Islamic conquest. And by the time the Muslims came on the scene in the 600s, many of the Christians in this part of the world, they had already been being persecuted by Roman Christians for 200 years. And so by the time the Muslims came and took over the Persian Empire and the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Romans just left and abandoned those Christians. And then they became double minorities in their own lands, but now under Islamic hegemony, which is still the case to this day.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.